Alright, so this is the chapter on graphs, which I have actually split up into three parts, and I'm going to record each part separately and upload a different video for each part just because otherwise we'll end up with a very large video and it's going to take me a very long time to upload. Right, so this is going to be the part one on graphs. All right, so what is going to be the chapter summary? What are we going to learn in this chapter? We are going to learn graphs and graph models. We're going to learn about terminology about graphs. We have learned about a little bit of terminology when we covered a part of graphs before when we did functions and relations. But in here, we're going to cover graphs with a lot more freedom and more general graphs that we did before. We are going to look at how to represent graphs and what is meant by graph isomorphism. That is a very, very important part, and you will see questions on based on graph isomorphism in your exam. And then finally, probably we may cover connectivity. Or I think I might end it with graph isomorphism. I'm going to make that decision and make that recording accordingly. All right, so the first part of this chapter, we're going to learn about different kinds of graphs, the applications of graphs in real world, and graph models, right, which are used to represent different kinds of real world applications. Okay, so this section is going to be mainly covering a basic introduction to graphs. We're going to learn about some terminology with respect to graphs. Then we're going to learn about graph taxonomy. That means different kinds of graphs that are out there, and then we're going to learn about graph models, so different kinds of these graphs that are used to represent different applications in the real world. All right, so now let's start with a basic definition of a graph, right? So a graph is basically defined using a set of vertices and a set of edges. All right, so the set of vertices is basically given by the letter capital V, and the set of edges is basically represented by the letter capital E. Right, so a graph G is nothing but a set of vertices and a set of edges. All right, and this is important. It's a non-empty set of vertices, so a graph should have at least one vertex, right? It may have no edges at all, but it should definitely have at least a single vertex in the set of vertices, right? So each edge, how do you represent each edge? Each edge is represented as a pair or a tuple, right? A tuple that consists of two of the vertices. So an edge basically is joining those two vertices. So an edge is basically associated with the two vertices that we have in the tuple, right? And these vertices are called the endpoints of your edge, right? And the edge has to connect these endpoints. So here is an example graph that we have. Okay, it has four vertices. The vertices are A, B, C, C and D. All right, and then we have five edges, right? So we have an edge from A to B, we have an edge from B to C, C to D, and then from D to B, and also from A to C. All right, so how do you represent these edges? So the edge between A and B is represented as A, comma, B. All right, the edge between B and C is represented as B, comma, C. The edge between C and D is represented as let's say D comma C or Z comma D. It doesn't matter which order here because this is undirected edges. We are going to come very soon to directed edges in just a couple of slides, but in this particular graph, these edges can be represented in with either edge written first, just because they are undirected edges, right? So there are some notes right here that I want you to look at. Okay, so in here we are going to study graphs in a more general scenario. Okay, so we did look at some digraphs or directed graphs and some basic graphs when we did functions and relations. However, in here we're going to look at more generalized graphs, right? So those graphs that we looked at the beginning of the semester were special graphs, right? And here we're going to look at graphs in a more general sense. Okay, so let's learn about some basic terminology that we need to understand before we go ahead with the more learning more properties about graphs, right? So we're going to learn about different kinds of graphs. So let's start with some basic graph, right? So the first kind of graph we're going to learn about is called a simple graph, right? So a simple graph is one where any two vertices are connected by a single edge, right? And there is no edge from a given vertex to itself, right? So a simple graph basically just has edges between two different vertices, right? And there has to be exactly one such edge between any two vertices, right? So now let's look at another kind of graph. And also another important thing is these edges are undirected in a simple graph, right? So the simple graph does not have loops. It has a single edge between any two vertices, and the edges are undirected, right? So now let's look at a multigraph, right? So let's look at the next kind of graph, which is your multigraph. So multigraph is a graph which allows for there to be multiple edges between any two different vertices, all right? So there are still no loops involved in a multigraph, right? But there can be multiple edges between two different vertices, right? So that is called a multigraph. And once again, here there is no direction associated with the edges, right? So when it comes to multigraphs, there is another important thing that you need to remember, which is the multiplicity, right? So the number of edges between the same pair of vertices gives you the multiplicity, right? So if you take the example, let's see the edge A and let's say edge C, okay? So there are two edges here that are going from A to C. So the multiplicity of the edge from A to C is going to be 2, right? So now let's introduce a loop, okay? So an edge that starts at a given vertex and ends at the same vertex is called a loop. So here the example of a loop is that, right? So that's a loop. There is an edge going from B to itself. That's called a loop. Now let's look at the third kind of graph, which is called a pseudograph, right? So a pseudograph is basically one which not only has multiple edges between two different vertices, but it also has loops, right? So let's go over this one more time. Simple graph, no loops. There has to be a single edge between any pair of vertices, right? And there is no direction involved on the edge. Now multigraph has multiple edges joining two different vertices, right? And the number of edges joining the same set of vertices is called the multiplicity, right, of that edge. Now, the next kind of graph is your pseudograph. So there are multiple edges. There are also loops involved in a pseudograph. Alright, so far we have been looking at graphs which have edges that do not have any direction. Alright, so now let's look at the next kind of graphs, which is directed graphs. So far we have been looking at undirected graphs. So now let's consider directed graphs. Alright, so now let's redefine graph for a directed graph. So directed graph G is basically consists of a set of vertices and a set of edges once again. However, the edges are basically ordered pairs, right? So when we defined a graph for an undirected graph, edges were just tuples or pair of vertices, right? But in here, these are ordered pairs, right? That means the order of the edge defines the direction in which the edge is going, right? So every edge is associated with an ordered pair of vertices. That's the important thing to remember here, right? So for example, if you have an edge pair u comma v, that means the edge is directed from u to v. So it starts at u and ends at v, right? So when the graphs have endpoints where the order doesn't matter, then it's called an undirected graph. All right. So when the edges are ordered pairs, right, that is when you have a directed graph. Okay, so some more terminology with respect to directed graphs continued here. So what exactly is a simple directed graph? So until now we looked at a simple graph. So when nothing is mentioned, you basically assume it's a simple undirected graph, right? So in here, if you want it to be a directed graph and it wanted to be a simple graph, then you actually have to say simple directed graph. All right. So what exactly is a simple directed graph? It should not have any loops and it should not have multiple edges between a set of two vertices. All right. So what do you notice in the given graph here? All right. So you see that there are no loops. So there is no edge going from a given vertex to itself. Right. So that is check one. Next one is there should not be multiple edges between two given vertices, right? So if you notice from A to B, there is just a single vertex. From A to C, there is only a single vertex. But what do you see from B to C here, right? There is still just a single vertex. There is still a single edge here, because one edge is going from C to B and the other edge is going from B to C. All right, so that is okay. That it does not count as multiple edges. It would have been a multiple edge if you had another edge like that. Right, so if you had another edge joining from C to B, then it would have multiple edges between C to B. So you can definitely have two edges between two given vertices if they are in the opposite direction in a simple directed graph. All right, so now let's talk about a directed multigraph. All right, so a directed multigraph is one which has loops. So now we're going to introduce loops, right? So an edge that starts at a given vertex and ends at the same vertex, that is a loop. It can have loops and it can have multiple directed edges between two given vertices. So if you look at the vertex A and vertex C, so you have two vertices going from A to C, right? So whereas in this case, two edges going from A to C. So in this case, what do you see was there is one edge going from B to C and the other edge is going from C to B. So you still have just a single edge between the two vertices. It's just in the opposite direction. But in this case, you have two edges that are going in the same direction. That's why this is a multigraph, right? And the multiplicity of B comma C, the edge B comma C is 2. The same way, the multiplicity of the edge A comma C is also 2, right? And the multiplicity of A comma B, since there's just a single edge, is basically 1. All right, so next we are going to look at graph models, right, that are used to represent basically real world applications where graphs are necessary. All right, so the very first example is your computer networks. Your computer networks is the biggest example in computer science, in the field of computer science, where you need to represent a network in the form of a graph. All right, so here we have an example. All right, so we have an example right here that is representing a computer network in the form of a graph. So each of the vertices is basically a data center, and each edge represents a communication link or a channel between these data centers. Right, so this is basically this application is simply using a simple graph, right? So the edges are undirected, and which may represent two-way communication, right? That means the communication is from back and forth between the edges. All right, so and then there are no loops, right? So this is a basic graph that is being used. This is an example of a basic graph that is being used to represent a simple computer network, right, where edges represent your data centers, and your vertices represent your data centers, and the edges between these data centers represent a channel or a communication link between these data centers. So let's look at other examples where graphs can be modeled. So now let's look at some special computer networks where different other kinds of graphs that we looked at in the last couple of slides can be used to model a network, right? So the first example here is basically a multigraph, basically an undirected multigraph, right? So it's possible to have different channels of communication between the same two data centers, right? So let's say you have a wireless link between two data centers, and you also have an optical channel, let's say, running between two data centers. Okay, so so each of these can be represented using a separate edge. Okay, so this is a multigraph that is trying to represent that there are data centers and there can be multiple communication links between the data centers. So let's look at the second example here. In the second example, we have basically added loops. All right, so we have added loops. So this is a pseudograph, all right, that represents a computer network where you have data centers as vertices, and there are edges representing communication links once again, and there can be diagnostic links or testing links that go from a given data center to itself. Right, so there can be test links that are used at different data centers before which they can use to test out before they actually send out their data on a channel to a separate to a different data center. Right, so this is the example of a computer network which is being represented using a pseudograph. All right, so let's look at the third example here. In here, we are using basically directed edges. All right, so here is an example of a computer network where, once again, vertices are data centers, and the links between the vertices represents what do you say, represent channels or communication links. So we have directed edges, right? So let's say you want to represent, right, basically different links, right? Multiple links between the both of them, and let's say the uplink speed is different from downlink speed, or the link speed in one direction is different from the link speed in the other direction between two set of same vertices, right? That's when you might want to use a multi-graph. All right, a directed multi-graph in order to represent a computer network. Okay, so we have seen different kinds of graphs like simple, multi, pseudo, directed, directed, and so on, right? So how do you understand what kind of a graph it is, right? For that you have to ask these three questions, right? So the first question is, are the edges directed or undirected? Right, so that's going to point towards whether your graph is a directed graph or an undirected graph. The next thing is going to be if there are multiple edges present between two vertices, right? That's going to tell whether it's a simple graph or a multi-graph. And the third question that you would ask is, are there loops present? So these are all the categories of graphs that we have seen so far. So a simple graph is undirected, right? If there is a simple graph and it is undirected, the edges are undirected, then there will not be multiple edges between two vertices, and there will be no loops, right? If it's a multi-graph and it is undirected, then there are no direction on the edges. Then there can be multiple edges between two given vertices, and once again loops are not allowed, right? Now what's a pseudograph? Pseudograph is one, a pseudograph is still undirected, right? And it has multiple edges present between two vertices, and it also has loops. Now let's move on to directed graphs. So let's move on to a simple directed graph, right? So of course, like the name says, it has directed edges between vertices. There cannot be multiple edges which are going in the same direction, right, between the same set of vertices. There can be multiple edges between two vertices provided they are going in opposite direction in a simple directed graph. Remember that. Right, and then of course there are no loops present. So what's a directed multigraph? A directed multigraph is, of course, there is direction on each of the edges, and then it can have multiple edges between two vertices that are going in the same direction, all right? And of course loops are allowed. Okay, let me point out to you, there is no such thing as a directed pseudograph, right? So there is a little difference between a multigraph, a regular multigraph, which is undirected, and a directed multigraph, right? So I want you to go back and understand that one more time. Okay, so now the final one is a mixed graph. All right, so mixed graph can have some directed edges, it can have some undirected edges as well. It can have multiple edges between the same set of vertices, and it can also have loops. So basically a mixed graph is one where everything goes, right? So let's take a look at other applications of graphs. So the first application that we saw was computer networks, which is one of the biggest basically application of the graph theory, right? So there are other applications as well which use graph modeling, right? Where the problem is modeled in terms of a graph to better understand and solve the issues in those applications. Right? And some examples are listed here. Social networks like Facebook, MySpace, they can be modeled as a graph. Communication networks, we have looked at that, a computer network similar to that. So information network, to show which way the information is flowing. Software design. So we're going to look at each of these examples in much more detail in the next couple of slides. Transportation networks such as air network or road network. Then we can have the biological networks like the RNA sequence and the DNA sequence can also be modeled in the form of graphs. In fact, it can be a challenge to find a subject or a field where graphs are not used. Right, so graphs are basically something that are very widely used not only in computer science but even outside the field of computer science. All right, so now let's take a look at each of those applications. So the first application was social networks. All right, so the example I gave you was what? Something like a Facebook, right? So what kind of a graph can you have? You can have something called a friendship graph, a collaboration graph, and influence graphs, right? So friendship graph, basically when you have a Facebook account, right? You have a list of friends and then they have their own set of friends and those friends have their own set of friends, right? So basically friendship graph would basically not only tell you who your friends are connected to but who they are connected to and so on, right? So how many hops away are you connected to a given person, right? So that is an example of a friendship graph. Then you have collaboration graphs. An example of collaboration graph is, let's say you have a bunch of people who are working together on a project or a bunch of people who are working together on a research. So how are they related among one another? Who are collaborating for this project or who are collaborating and working together to produce this research? Right, so that would give you a collaboration graph. All right, so the next one is influence graph. Influence graph is basically tells you how one person or one entity can influence another person. So if you notice, the friendship graph and your collaboration graphs are undirected, right? So it simply suffices to show that there is an edge between two entities or two people to show the friendship or that they're collaborating. But influence, you want to know who influences who, right? So that's why you need a directed graph in that scenario. Right, so for example, you can have an edge from one person to another person, which says that the first person can actually influence the second person. All right, so some more into the graph models for social networks. So the first one that you have here is the example of a friendship graph. All right, so if there is an edge between two people, that means they are directly friends. All right, so if there are you have to reach a person by 2 hops, that means they're a friend of a friend, right? And if you can reach them by 3 hops, then they're a friend of a friend of a friend, and so on. Right, so this is an example. The second one is an example of an influence graph. So if you notice, the first one was an undirected graph. There were no direction on the edges because if X is a friend of Y, then Y is a friend of X. There is no way either direction matters. All right. However, in an influence graph, you need to know who influences who. All right. So here you have people. And basically, if there is an edge here, for example, there is an edge going from Brian to Linda, which tells that Brian can influence Linda. All right, so here are how you can basically model a social network like Facebook into a influence graph. Here are 2 examples of collaboration graphs, right? So within, it can be a social network, you can say, within a network of people, you can have collaboration graph. So the first example is a Hollywood graph, uh, and the second example is an academic collaboration graph. right? So the Hollywood graph basically would basically create links between all the actors in the films who have worked together. All right, and an academic collaboration graph would tell us who are all the people who together produced a piece of research or a paper together. All right, so so these are two examples of basically a collaboration graph, people working together. All right, so the next example is that of an information network. All right, so here we have once again two examples, a web graph, uh, a web graph and a citation network. All right, so a web graph basically you have web pages connected to one another. So you have links on web pages, and when you click on those links, it takes you to a new page, right? And then there are links on that, and then you click on the link and it takes you to another page, and so on. Right? So a web graph basically tells you how each of these web pages are linked together. Right? The next example is that of a citation network. Right? So when you write a research paper, towards the end, you basically cite all the other research papers that you have basically considered or that you have taken information from and used in your paper. All right, so basically you can draw a citation network basically showing the link from this paper that you have written to all the other papers that you have drawn information from. Right, so that is another example of an information network. Okay, moving on, let's look at transportation graphs. All right, so here is an example. You have airline networks, and then you have your road networks, right? So airline networks can be modeled as graphs, okay? So basically linking the cities together, the airports in the cities together, and you can basically represent the flight that goes from one city to another city using a directed edge. Right. Similarly, you can have road networks that can be modeled as graphs, right? So if there are vertices, basically, which can represent intersections within the roads, and edges actually represent the roads on which these vehicles are moving, right? So you can have undirected edges to represent two-way roads, right? And if there are one-way roads, they can be represented using directed edges. All right, so moving on, another application of basically your graphs is software design, right? So when you're trying to design a software, right, you can follow something called a top-down approach, where you divide the software into smaller pieces or modules, and each module is basically designed or developed by a different person or a different team, right, depending on the size of the module. Right, so how can you model software design? You can you can basically model the software design in terms of module dependency graph. Right, so that is what is given right here, a module dependency graph, in order to represent what kind of a dependency exists between these software modules. All right, so that means some modules have to be developed earlier, and this other modules depend on these earlier modules to be developed. Right, so this is an example that shows you module dependency graph. So since it's a dependency, you have directed edges. So you have the main program, right, which depends on display, it depends on a parser, and it depends on the protocol, right? So now display depends on something else, and so on and so forth. Right, so module dependency graph is something that is used in the process of software design, and basically that models the process of software design in the form of a graph. All right, so here is another example going deeper down into the module itself. All right, so let's say you're writing a program in a module. Okay, so the program is made up of a set of instructions, right? So you have a precedence graph to tell which instruction has to come before which one. So your program is usually a sequence of steps, right? So here is an example representing all the steps within the given program, and that which step has to be executed before which step and so on is modeled using the graph given, right? So you can actually model loops and recursion as well using this kind of a precedence graph, right? So this is called a precedence graph, all right? This kind of a precedence graph, and it becomes much easier to write the program if you understand the sequence in which the program must continue. Okay, so the next application, moving on, is biological application, right? So the DNA sequences and RNA sequences was something I talked about, but here you have another example which basically shows a forest ecosystem and the different species in the forest and how they are linked together in, let's say, a food chain. Okay, so here is an example of a niche overlap graph. So this is called a niche overlap graph, basically, which shows what are the different species in an ecosystem and how they are connected together, right? So the vertices are representing the species, and if there is an edge connecting two vertices, it shows that those two species are going to fight for or compete for the same food resources. All right, so this is called a niche overlap graph, and this is used in the biological application. So moving on, like I mentioned, so here is an example of an RNA sequence in a human cell, which is represented using graph modeling. Right? So you can have something called a protein interaction graph, where basically vertices represent the proteins, and basically if there are edges, it shows how these proteins interact, right? So we've heard about DNA matching and RNA matching, right? That has to happen, in a crime scene, or in order to show that, there was this person who was present at a given location, right? And how does these matchings happen? So the matching is actually a graph problem. We're not going to study that, but the matching of the graphs is basically a graph problem, which is used in the process of DNA matching and RNA matching, and so on. All right, so this is going to be the end of part one for graphs, right? And there are going to be two more parts, right? There is going to be two more parts coming up, and part two is going to contain most of the stuff that we need to learn about graphs. So the part one here was mostly introduction. We just learned about different kinds of graphs. And then in part two, we're going to learn mainly about what are the different graph problems, all right, and how to solve them. So so yeah, please read all three parts for the part of graphs, and yes, part two is going to come up very soon.